Rahim. My name is Dr. Saima Anis, and I'm here today. We're meeting with pioneers in the field from the subcontinent. And my guest today is Dr. Athar Usama. Welcome, Athar.
Thank you very much. Good to be here.
Glad to have you. Before we begin, let me tell you a little bit about Athar. So Dr. Athar Usama is basically the founder and chief executive of the Pakistan Innovation Foundation and the curator of Pakistan 2047 Initiative. He's also the founder and managing director of Innovators Global Private Limited, where he serves as an advisor and a lead mentor for the Standard Chartered Women in Tech program and the director of the Venture Lab, which is Pakistan's first ideas accelerator for professionals and faculty, university faculty. He's also been very involved in science and technology. One of the things that he's done is founded the STEMx, which is the STEM School for the World. He'll tell us more about that. As a former member of the Planning Commission with the government of Pakistan, Dr. Athar played a very lead role with higher education. He was responsible for carrying out due diligence, and he used public funding to get a deep and broad understanding of the public sector and inform their policy landscape and decision-making capabilities. He's spearheaded a lot of different initiatives, where one of them is carrying on with 5 national centers in AI, robotics, big data and cloud, cybersecurity, space applications, and he's also just championed a national startup and a 21st century global skills initiative. Now, if that doesn't impress you, I don't know what will. So let's say a warm welcome to Athar, who's been a friend, a mentor, a mentee to many others, and a great individual. Welcome, and happy to be here with you today. Tell us, Athar, what led you on this path?
Thank you very much, Saima, for inviting me. As you know, I've moved back to Pakistan about 10 years ago now. Before that, I spent about 7 years in the US while I was doing my PhD at the RAND Corporation, and then another 6 years in the UK, where I worked for a private company. I was the head of Middle East operations for that company for a couple of years before moving back to Pakistan. So I started off really as a research scholar. One of the things that I was really interested at the time that I was applying for my PhD was to try to understand how governments can create the environment and policy that leads to places like Silicon Valley to appear. So if I look at my research statement at the beginning of my PhD program, you would find that as the question that I wanted to address. When I reached the US and started working, through my PhD and with other researchers at RAND, I realized that that's probably not a very useful question to ask, because most of the literature that I read and most of the people that I talked to were of the view that oftentimes when governments try to create places like Silicon Valley, they don't succeed. They usually appear as a result of accidents, historical accidents. So then, at some point, 9/11 happened, and 9/11 changed a lot of things for all of us. I was at RAND at the time. There was a lot of discussion of research on terrorism and Islamic extremism, and Pakistan found itself in a tight spot. And by engaging in those conversations, I realized that our approach towards the American policymakers has always been that Pakistan always want the American policymakers to respect them, to understand our point of view, to respect our contributions, our sacrifices for whatever they are worth. And it's always been like that. And even today, when you look at what is happening today with this fall of Kabul, we are in the same place where we started right at the start of 9/11, where we are saying to Americans, please respect our contributions, respect our sacrifices. We are actually begging for respect. And as I interacted more and more with the research community and with the policymakers in the US, I realized that respect cannot be something you can ask for. It has to be earned. America only respects those who are strong, and so we have to become strong to be able to be respected. You can't beg for respect. You have to earn that respect.
Correct.
And the way for us to become strong is for us to sort out our own mess first, right? And that day I decided that I wouldn't live in America anymore. I would move back to Pakistan.
It takes a lot out of an individual and out of a community to be able to support issues such as those that you support. Let me start somewhere where, how did you make your trek from aeronautical engineering in Risalpur, Pakistan to this RAND policymaking school? And I'm only asking that question because the diaspora here has children and teens and people who are looking to further their career in different areas. And they'd like to get an understanding of what it is that informs somebody who makes such decisions.
So, by the time I got to the point where I was gonna go into engineering, I realized that my interest lay somewhere else. So I realized that I loved economics.
What was that point of realization, Athar, to you personally?
So it was almost while I was doing my FSc that transition was happening. I became interested in
economics. Just in your college years.
12th grade, so 12th grade essentially, right? So that realization was beginning to happen, and I realized that I was interested in economics instead of the minute issues of technology. I was more interested in the macro issues of how things happen and how nations progress. Another person that I used to admire when I was growing up, and a lot of that credit goes to my mother, was Dr. Abdul Salam.
Yes.
I had grown up admiring him and the science that he did and the visibility that he brought to Pakistan. And so I was also aware of the fact that Dr. Abdul Salam, while his contribution to science were tremendous, his contribution to science policy was even bigger. He was a tremendous institution builder. He built the International Center for Theoretical Physics, which has enabled over 150,000 scientists from all over the developing world today to do science while living in their own countries, so that they don't have to leave their countries like Abdul Salam had to leave his country to be able to go to the UK and do his science so that he could win the Nobel Prize. So essentially, by doing that, he enabled a lot of other scientists from the developing world to not have to make that choice. So I think that was another thing that was on my mind. While I was doing my engineering, I realized that I didn't want to be that practical engineer anymore. I wanted to be the policymaker, the institution builder, and the person who enabled other engineers to become more effective.
You wanted to abstract it out to different ideas.
Yes, exactly. So, and that was also a bit naive for me. I thought that if I could really learn how to do this, that I would get an opportunity in a silver plate to make it happen. What I didn't realize, obviously, as a 19-year-old, 20-year-old, was that Abdul Salam had his influence because of his science, not in addition to his science, right? So obviously, when I had decided that I didn't want to do engineering anymore, I started applying to programs abroad that would take me to where I wanted to go. I applied for the Rhodes Scholarship, and I became one of the 10 finalists, that year. And then I applied to RAND, and RAND was really love at first sight. So it's an amazing school. If you get in, you basically get a PhD scholarship.
I remember applying to it after you had applied and been through it, and we met at RAND for the very first time in Santa Monica. Those were the best golden years of our lives.
So it's an amazing place, and I always thought more and more Pakistanis should go to RAND. In fact, I encouraged in the earlier years. I used to come home and do orientation talks at universities so that other people could apply. It's just really unfortunate. I think so far, including myself, only 3 Pakistanis have gone to that program. But it's a really an amazing place, particularly for those who live in the US and want to have influence on the US policy scene, I think PhD from Rand is really very, very powerful. It's more, I think, more powerful.
It really is. Let me ask you this. It sounds like the point at which you are in your career, you're doing initiatives that are almost giving back to what you've learned, in the science field, technology field, and also, with women's development. So tell us a little bit about that. What are you doing with these STEM schools?
Yeah, so the idea of the STEM school really is, I didn't start off it thinking that way, that this is kind of my way of giving back and helping out kids like me who at the age of 18 didn't know what to do with their lives, right? Or they wanted to do something that was not for them. So the way we started is, when I came back to Pakistan, I started a non-profit by the name of Pakistan Innovation Foundation. We wanted to create and run programs that help Pakistanis to become to use innovation and creativity to solve Pakistan's problems. We ran a number of different programs. We did innovation challenges, hackathons, prizes, conferences, all kinds of stuff. And one of the things that we realized was that a lot of times the people who usually participated in our programs were university students, usually in their third and fourth year, who were looking for a project or looking for some kind of mentorship to help them do something with their final years. And as we worked with them more and more, we realized that they lacked a lot of things. They lacked, for example, any domain knowledge. They didn't have any domain knowledge. They also lacked the necessary skills of creativity and innovation. Just because they are not taught in our schools, we don't teach our kids to act that way. And third, they also lacked the time to actually innovate. Most of them were about to graduate. As soon as they would graduate, they would be looking for a job. Innovation requires a lot of time, oftentimes a lot of time. So when we realized that, I started saying in my circles, in my professional circles, that I don't want to work with university students because of this and that. So some of my friends said,
okay, too late for the university students to start at that phase, right?
So some of my friends said, okay, so now you understand Pakistan's problem. Pakistan's problems actually start in the school. So what can you do with so what are you doing? What is Pakistan Innovation Foundation doing with the schools? And I, initially I didn't have an answer to that question, because schools is like a big animal. If you want to work with universities, which 10 universities you want to work with, but there are 300,000 schools in Pakistan. So for a group of 5 people that we were, where do you start from, right? Anyways, a couple of years later, we came up with this idea of creating this unique fellowship. It was called the National STEM School at the time, where we used to pick 30-40 of the brightest students that we could find, high school students in Pakistan, and we used to take them to
LUMS. Did you apply? Sorry.
So so we do. People apply for it online. They also do an online test, and then I shortlist some students for an interview. And I've interviewed almost 1,000 students in the last 5 years, personally, for about 10 to 15 minutes. And what I'm trying to do in those 10 to 15 minutes is try to understand that person's story. I want to understand whether this person is just about grades, or is he really struggling with science, with STEM in his life? Does he really want to make some meaning of it? Or is it just about, okay, I want to do this course to get a certificate, or I want to cram and, sort of get good grades. And we've actually tried to admit students that, to our mind, are likely to be, for them, this STEM experience is going to be more beneficial. Mm-hmm. Right? So most of my admits are not kids who get straight A's. They are sometimes kids who are struggling on the side, who make things, break things, who actually want to make something meaningful with science and STEM. So we take these kids to LUMS for 10 days. We also bring about 6 to 8 professors.
And LUMS is the Lahore University of Management Sciences.
LUMS is the Lahore University of Management Sciences.
For those who don't know.
We've also done this program with some other universities as well over the last few years. And we put them with 6 to 8 professors, and we make them work hands-on in the labs. So essentially, these high school students are getting an exposure of essentially university and even beyond university. I remember, so I'm an aeronautical engineer. In my 4 years of engineering, we never built an aircraft. We never designed an aircraft. But these kids, eighth grade kids, actually go to the lab. They actually design an airfoil. They create, they make a wind tunnel, and they calculate lift on that airfoil for all angles of attack. Now that's something I never did at university. So these are the sorts of things we make these students.
We never
do
did
every
that
day.
in physics either, even if
Absolutely,
it was a
absolutely.
higher level physics.
So with that level of hands-on experiential knowledge, these kids come out really transformed. So one of the things that almost half of the students tell me when they graduate from this program is they tell me that when they came to the program, they knew what they wanted to become. Now they don't know anymore, because we have exposed them to at least 5-6 different disciplines that they never thought were really interesting. So we had a girl who came to me and said, I want to become a doctor because I hate mathematics. She came to the program. We forced her to do programming on one single day, and then she ended up taking a 5-day project on programming, and now wants to do artificial intelligence. Right? So we have tons of stories of students who had made career choices that were based on a sample of one. My dad is an engineer, so I want to become an engineer. I went to a hospital, I saw a neurologist, so I want to become a neurologist. But when they actually engage with real professionals, real people, and we invite at least two practicing STEM professionals every day from Pakistan and abroad to come and talk to these kids, their life perception changes, their career choices changes, and I tell them, okay, now you're going to make the right choice. Like me, who spent 4 years doing in engineering and then decided he wanted to do something else. If I had experienced what you are experiencing today, you would have made that choice in the first place. So that's one thing.
In fact, then become a big mentor for these people, for these kids.
Well, not just me. There's a whole team of scholars who are involved in this process. Last year we invited more than 50 people from all around the world. 30% of them international, non-Pakistani scholars. 50% of them international scholars, which include both Pakistanis and non-Pakistanis.
Question.
And 25% women.
How
to
do
come
you
and talk
engage and incentivize their engagement, these scholars from all over the world?
Well, so I think for the scholars, it's more like also a passion. So most of myself and other people who are engaged in this, we are doing it as a way of giving back to our country. We have also seen some of these scholars actually develop a following amongst high school students in Pakistan. So they have their own kind of very elite fan bases now, where if they go to Karachi, you'll find that there are lots of schools who invite them to come and speak to the kids because they know that Dr. Faisal is so great, and Dr. Sabi and all these other people. So I think a lot of these scholars do it as a way of giving back as well, and a lot of our program runs on that idea of giving back to the society. Since last year, that program has gone virtual. Because of COVID, we realized that we won't be able to do this program physically for another 2 years. So we went virtual, and the program suddenly started scaling. We've also started getting students from all around the world. So we now have students from the Middle East, Bahrain, Qatar, Saudi Arabia,
That's
Oman.
something our audiences in the US and worldwide, the subcontinent diaspora, would like to know about, How can we get our youngsters engaged?
So I can tell you, this is an amazing program also for expat students. This is also amazing. I had a friend whose kid applied from Bahrain. The son had come to Pakistan, once or twice, but really didn't engage much here. Didn't make any friends. He remained very secluded in his group. So he joined one of our programs. For the first couple of days, he was a bit nervous. I think some kids were also making fun of him. So he came to me, he said, "Why have you selected me? Why am I here?" And I told him, I said, I think you're a very intelligent kid, and I'm sure you'll be able to get over this. By day 3 and 4, the situation started changing, and by the end of the program, this Bahraini Pakistani kid was, literally the star of the audience. right? He was friends with everybody, and his father came to pick him up on graduation. And after looking at what had happened, he told me this thing. He said, Athar, this is the single most important investment that I've done in my son.
What is
Because
the
now
duration of the program, Athar?
so the program duration of the program is 10 days. When we do physical, we obviously ask people to come to Pakistan physically and attend the program physically. I think the physical program is very strenuous, but it is also an amazing experience to actually live and work with other Pakistani kids your age. Since last year, we are doing the same program virtually as well. So last year, we had a couple of kids from the US participating in the program, and a couple of kids from UK, and then there were a girl from Dubai and all that. So I actually feel this is an amazing program for re-acclimatization of expat kids.
Yes.
It's not just a great way to learn science from some of the best minds around the world. It's also a way to make amazing friends with Pakistan, with Pakistanis and other people from around the world.
I think that's a great initiative. I would highly recommend it. We would put up the website once you share it with us to share with our audiences, and something that the US diaspora definitely needs to know, and worldwide as well. Tell me, how are you impacting women, and what are you doing with AI and robotics?
So basically, the AI and robotics piece was in 2016. I got an opportunity to serve for a couple of years in the government. I was a member of the Planning Commission, which is responsible for all federal level development expense. So I was responsible for science and technology, IT, and higher education under Minister Ehsan Iqbal. I worked from January 2017 to January 2019, and one of the leading initiatives that of the ministry and Ehsan Iqbal Sahab at the time was that he wanted to create these national centers in fourth industrial revolution technologies, so AI, robotics, cloud computing and big data, cybersecurity, and space applications. So I was part of that exercise. I helped design these national centers. They are a very unique model that we tried. So usually in Pakistan, the way development happens is that you want to set up a national center. Some university will come and say, okay, we'll build a building. It will take 3 years for the building to be built. In the process, we will either send people abroad to do PhDs, or we will start hiring PhDs from other universities to make up our own staff. And so there's a lot of poaching of people from other places. Instead of that, what we did was we said we're not going to spend even a single rupee on buildings. All these centers would be virtual. We will fund, as part of these networks, whoever is active in a particular area. So about 200 teams actually applied to be part of these 5 national centers. And out of those 200 teams, we actually funded about 53. So we now have these 5 national centers, which are vertical, which are virtual. They are headquartered at a university, but that headquarter is only a shell. All these national centers have these network of labs, and each lab is focusing on solving a scientific problem of either international or national importance, right? So for example, we have a lab at ComSats University in Islamabad that is focusing on developing AI applications, medical diagnostic applications for AI, right? So they are working on X-rays and breast cancer scans and brain tumors. We have other labs which is working on national security applications. We have another lab that is working on national infrastructure protection. So each lab has a target they have to achieve. They also have to they also have to produce spin off certain number of technologies during the course of the process, and they also have to at least earn that much money in 5 years that was spent on them. So that's our kind of process for making them sustainable. So it's a very unique model in Pakistan. Again, it's only been 3 years that these have been set up, so it's still work in progress. But I think this was the first time really that we thought really hard about how can we invest in people and their equipment rather than buildings. and how can we enable whoever was doing good work, irrespective of wherever they are, to try to advance this new technology, this agenda of new technologies forward.
So human and social capital versus infrastructure support, which
Absolutely.
has historically been something that developing nations and Pakistan and India and Bangladesh perhaps have invested in previously, with not as tangible results. We have big institutes and centers, but the work of excellence is not being produced. So here you have venture labs and you have other instances where it provides people the opportunity, and it's virtual, therefore it's just the hard work that pays and shows through. So that's commendable. You also have been doing a lot of work in promoting science and science-based ideas within the Muslim world. And so tell us your motivation for that, Athar, and what have you done so far? I'm sure our audiences would love to know, your contributions to Jordan, Malaysia, the OIC, perhaps.
Yes. So I became accidentally I became a scholar of science in the Muslim world. When 9/11 happened, people wanted me to talk to audiences about why do they hate us, and those kinds of questions. And initially I tried to speak to those topics, but then I basically started saying, look, I'm not an expert on why do they hate us. I can, I'm a scholar of science policy. I can talk about science in the Muslim. So that's how it kind of started. After 9/11, I started talking about the Muslim world. Then in 2007, there was a journal, an online journal in the UK, which was called SciDev.net. So SciDev asked me to start writing a column.
With the SciDev.
Yeah. So SciDev asked me to start writing a column on science policy and politics of the Muslim world, which I did for about 4 years. And when I moved back to Pakistan, again, this is something that sort of automatically, developed, that, those series of columns became a blog, and then the blog became a community blog. And then we decided, okay, we want to start an online magazine, which was called muslimscience.com, so muslim-science.com. One of the things that we wanted to do at the time was we wanted to create conversations within the Muslim world that were driven from inside the Muslim world rather than coming from outside the Muslim world. So I remember, I think in 2006 or 7, Nature did a supplement on Islam and science, and I think 3 out of 4 of those articles were basically sort of written by people from the West. And I was kind of slightly infuriated. I said, why is the West speaking for us? So I started looking for voices from within the Muslim world. And one of the things that we launched when I moved back to Pakistan, with the support from John Templeton Foundation in Pennsylvania, is to create this series of task forces where we used to convene scholars from within the Muslim world to come and talk about issues of importance in the Muslim world. Okay. And that was the idea, to have the debate internally rather than externally. So one of the first task forces that we did was on the state of science in the universities of the Muslim world. This was chaired by the science advisor to the Prime Minister of Malaysia. We had the task force in Kuala Lumpur. The task force was ultimately sort of written up in Nature, so it was great. The second task force that we did was on the difficult issues between science and religion, science and Islam. Again,
those are very, very tricky subjects to explore.
Yes, so they are very tricky subjects. So we, obviously we got a wide range of scholars. We had the leading sort of Muslim cleric from Malaysia. Obviously, the task force was chaired by the former Secretary General of the OIC, Professor Akwaluddin Ehsanoglu. We had a bunch of philosophers, a bunch of social scientists, and we were really trying to explore these issues from a multidimensional standpoint. So that task force actually concluded in Istanbul, and we issued what we call the Istanbul Declaration for Engagement Between Science and Islam. And I think that declaration is really important. We were very pleased when the Islamic Academy of Sciences in Jordan asked us to launch the report in Jordan in front of the Islamic Academy of Sciences. We didn't think we would go very far with this with the academies of sciences in the Muslim world, But I think Islamic Academy of Sciences inviting us to launch that report with Princess Sumaya, leading that process was
Royal
very, very
Highness.
encouraging. Yes, Royal Highness. And the third task force that we've done is on the culture of science in the Muslim world. Again, this was chaired by Her Royal Highness Princess Sumaya. This was based in Amman, and that report is also out. And we've done a really interesting survey in that task force that also sheds lights on certain very important aspects of the culture of science in the Muslim world, which we don't think anybody so far has empirically evaluated. So I think that's some interesting work. I believe the work on the Islamic world front is of a long-term nature. Things happen slowly in the Muslim world. I think when you contribute something, gradually it begins to trickle down.
Where do you see this going? This initiative on science in the Muslim world.
So I think this will slowly make an impact. One of the things that came out of our second task force report was this notion that in order to make an impact, we need to really start training teachers in the Muslim world. So we then developed and ran a project to develop a methodology for science teachers in the Muslim world to teach science holistically in a Muslim classroom. And by teaching science holistically, I mean bringing, teaching science, but also looking into the fact that oftentimes the questions that arise in the classroom are non-scientific in nature. So you might be teaching evolution or cosmology, and the student might ask, okay, but this is all fine, but this is written in the Quran. So how does the teacher address that question, right? So we actually developed a methodology, which is not unique. I think it's unique in the Muslim context, but we've developed a methodology that enables the teacher to first ask the question, what kind of question is this? Is this a scientific question? Is this a religious question? Is this an ethical question? Is this a philosophical question? And then based on what kind of question is this, he or she can begin to answer that question.
And that that delineation of the different aspects of this particular question is very difficult.
Yes, exactly. And sometimes questions are both religious and scientific. So for example, one of the questions that we test with our teachers is, we talk about the impossible burger. And a student asks, is an impossible burger haram or halal, right?
Right.
So this is a scientific and religious question. So the teacher has an obligation to answer the scientific part of it. So what are the ingredients of the impossible burger? Is this actually meat or not? If it's just a plant extract, then there is no question of halal or haram in it, right? But then, what is halal or haram is not the domain of the teacher, right? So he or she can answer the scientific question, and then let the people, ask the student to go and ask the religious person. So, that this Islam and science exercise, I think it's a long-term exercise. I don't expect the Muslim world to change overnight. I think there are some positive changes. There are some negative things still. And I think it will take some time before these things.
What are your parting thoughts for people that follow your space and your field of work, and people who would like to be menteed in processes such as what you inform the world with?
No, so I think for the young kids, I always tell them to follow their passions. Don't learn for the sake of grades. You should learn for the sake of learning. And acquiring knowledge, and always give your passions a shot, because a lot of times our parents and elders, even though they are trying to do good for us, do not realize that when we follow our passions, we are the most happy, and we are in the best place. So a lot of kids make career choices that are forced by the society, that are forced by the parents, and they don't end up really happy with their lives, and so they don't make really a good impact. I feel that if you're doing what you love, you will never have to work even a day in your life. As I've never had to work even a day in my life.
That's exactly how we feel about this. Anyway, it was really nice having you here today, Athar. I'm glad you were able to join us and inform our audiences of what you're doing with science and technology for the betterment of kids in the Muslim world, for science and education and ethics and religion in the Muslim world, other than your innovative ventures for women and all the venture labs that you've been doing. So thank you again. Thanks to our audiences for joining us today. Allah Hafiz.